You know, I always wanted to make a clickbait thumbnail like this. The worst gladiator. What does the worst even mean? Well, a worst is something that's very, very bad, but what is a bad character? What makes a bad character? What makes a bad character? Well, that's a very interesting question because what is a character? And just not to keep it philosophical, we'll split into two groups. We'll have the generalist and the specialist. The generalists are all around great in most situations, and specialists specialize in certain situations. In our game, for an example, we have the archer, who is pretty all around stable, ranged single target damage unit, and we have Dodge's archer, I think it's called a marksman actually, who focuses more on heavy bursts at the cost of attack speed, while also utilizing a form of group morale boost. So he is different from the archer. There's two types of specialists: the side grade, which is equivalent to the generalist, but is better at something, and then there's the function, which is worse than the specialist but adds a new function. Again, we have the marksman, who is like the archer, and then we have the ratman, who is like the archer but deals less damage overall for the cost of reducing stamina over time. So now that we have the two different types of specialists, what makes something bad is usually it being a side grade. But what if a side grade isn't very specialized? What if it's too niche to be specialized? Well, if you get that, well, then you have today's episode, the drummer. The drummer is one of two tanks in the game, the drummer and the rhino. Both gladiators having a taunt, so they're very similar. Each have 3 abilities: basic attack, a taunt, and a passive that reduces damage dealt to them. So which one is the specialist and which one is the generalist? Well, since if you play with the no random gladiators mode on, you will find the rhino first. So I'm gonna argue that the rhino is generalist and the drummer is therefore the specialist. So how do the two of them differ from each other? So let's begin with the passives, since they're the simplest. They both ignore damage, 40% for the drummer and 30% for the rhino. This of course is an advantage for the drummer because the less damage you take, the more effective health you have. Effective health is the concept of the actual amount of health is worth more than the actual number itself. So 100 health on the dwarf or the drummer would be 40% larger, so 100 health would turn into 140, while on the rhino 100 health would turn into 130. This is how much damage the opponent has to deal in order to reduce that number to 0. So for every point in attribute point that you assign to health, the dwarf will get 224 and the rhino will get 208. A 16 health difference. This would put the drummer at a 0.1 attribute advantage, since for every 10 health the rhino invests, the drummer only has to invest 9. Most skills in this game have a stamina cost and some sort of multiplier, an execution time and a cooldown. So in order to compare the two melee attacks, we'll compare the scaling, the stamina, the estimated time scaling, and the cooldown scaling. So first of all, what we can see is that the cooldown scaling is the exact same of 10, so we will not discuss that any further. We will see that the strength scaling is literally the twice as fast for the rhino compared to the dwarf. The agility scaling from the dwarf is 50% better by 1, which is not a lot. And you can see that the rhino attacks faster both at its minimum and maximum, and also requires less agility to earn its maximum, while the dwarf requires more agility but attacks slower at both stages. This of course results in that if you, for each 1 strength and 1 agility, you will gain more DPS in both stages as the rhino. So what's the downside of the Rhino? Well, the downside of the Rhino is that the attack of the Rhino costs more stamina. As you can see, it's 19 plus 3.75 per level, and for the Rhino it's 25 per 5 per level. So it's going to be slightly more expensive, which is why we are going to have to buy stamina for the Rhino later on to compensate for this. That concludes us by saying that essentially the attack speed of the Drummer is faster, but the DPS is lower, but the Rhino has a higher stamina cost. Now let's take a look at the taunt ability. Taunt ability is basically the bread and butter of these two gladiators, since this is what makes them tanks. In the early game, as we can see, the estimated time and cooldown reduction is slower for the Rhino. They have the same size and the max same size and a minimum size. The Rhino gets a bigger taunt quicker, and it takes longer or more agility for the dwarf, the drummer, to get his taunt online. You can also see that generally the stamina cost once again is higher for the Rhino, which means that during every match the Rhino will have to spend more stamina to perform the same actions, the same amount of actions as the drummer, which we will take into account. So let's take a look at those stamina costs. If we assume that a match or a battle is 20 seconds and that the Rhino has the lowest execution time and lowest cooldown on both his taunt and its attack, then per level it costs 1.25 extra stamina and 2.5 extra stamina for the attack and taunt. The attack has a 1.45 delay, putting it at 0.8 extra stamina per attack per second, and the taunt goes from 2.5 divided by 4, since it has a 4-second delay, to 0.625 additional stamina use per second. So if we combine this with times the duration of the battle, it's 29.74, which, let's round up and say it's 30, which puts it at 0.6 attribute points spent on stamina per level. This concludes that the Rhino has a 0.6 disadvantage in stamina, and the Dwarf has a 0.1 advantage in terms of health. So currently there's a 0.7 difference in favor of the Dwarf. So let's see what the Rhino is good at. The Rhino is cheaper to get online. The Dwarf needs 250 strength, 250 agility, and 10 intellect for a total of 510. The Rhino needs 200 strength, 63 agility, and 10 intellect for a total difference of 237 differences, which is in attribute points 119. 119 attribute points is 24 levels. This means the Rhino will be fully scaled at level 47, while the Drummer will take until level 71, which means that the Rhino has 119 ability points to play with, 14 of which have to be spent on stamina, which leaves us with 105, which, to play up to the Dwarf's strength, let's put it in health. During those 24 levels, having spent the 14 attribute points buying stamina, it has 105 attribute points left to buy health. The effective health that the Rhino can accumulate over this time is 21,840 at level 71. And after this point, the Dwarf is now fully scaled as well and is able to compete in the health scaling race, in which the Dwarf wins by plus 16 per attribute point. But how many attribute points will it take for the Dwarf to gain 21,840? It will take 1,365 attribute points, or the Dwarf being at level 344, assuming that the Rhino also keeps buying health until level 344. So, is this finally where the Dwarf gets better than the Rhino at level 344? Well, no. The only real draw for the Dwarf is the 0.2 faster taunt that it gained at level 71. It has the same amount of health currently, but the DPS is lower. Which means that if a dwarf and a rhino were to start attacking each other and they would keep only the dwarf buying health and the rhino only buying strength, the rhino would beat the dwarf every single time in 29 seconds. So even now, in the late game, where the dwarf should be at its strongest due to the extra health, effective health per health point, it's still sort of bad. So which situation should you pick the dwarf in? Well, the only situations where the dwarf is better than the rhino is after level 71, preferably level 344, but after level 71 it's technically where the taunt is at its peak and won't get any better no matter what you do. And then you should only play him if you're not planning on having 2 tanks, which means in arenas where there's a low gladiator amount, and generally you should pick him only against teams that have a very high interrupt, so something like the Banshee Scream for an example. However, even with that, the 0.2 is still too slow to avoid something like most knockbacks, so I would generally advise only picking the dwarf in the late game as a solo tank against one single boss. And yes, that is going to be all for the video. I hope you learned something. Please let me know if I made some mistakes or if you have any thoughts on what to do next. Thank you guys so much. Remember to like and subscribe and all that shenanigans, and I'll see you next time.